guys. Appreciate you coming into the session. And it's a really fascinating insight to see the stuff that's going on with the Royal Ballet at the moment. That's really cool. Also, just a quick thanks to Fusion Sport and to Marcus Lloyd for the invite to come and present some of the work that, working alongside Jon, we've managed to do at Cardiff Met and give an insight in really the way that we see a bit of a strategy in terms of how we test strength, power and speed in our younger athletes, and also some insights into training. It'll be a bit of a whistle stop, but let's crack on. So when we think of strength and power, I'll be focused on that topic, and then Jon will bring us home on speed. But when we're thinking about why is strength and power important in our younger athletes, well, from a performance enhancement perspective, obviously we're trying to make athletes as strong and powerful as we possibly can. We know that some strength and power characteristics can differentiate between different levels of standard of athlete, especially as they go into sort of adolescence and early adulthood. So for us, it's really about trying to get athletes to perform to their maximum. But also it's become increasingly important, especially when you look at the evidence from the research, in terms of strength and power as being important protective mechanisms against neuromuscular and musculoskeletal injuries. So we have a sort of a dual role in terms of trying to improve performance, but also reduce the relative risk of injury in our athletes. And some of our athletes, I say that we have an after-school program where we have different sports come in, and those athletes receive some after-school strength conditioning provision. So here's just, I suppose, looking at the ratio between force and velocity as we go through the curve, and some recent publications within the strength conditioning literature has revolved around when we're trying to develop power, or these force-producing capacities in athletes, that we try to surf the curve. So realistically, we're trying to improve their ability to produce force at a wide range of different movement velocities. And these things will feature in terms of both our testing and also from our training. So we don't want to just hang our hats on one, expression or test for these qualities, but actually try to assess those athletes over a range of different protocols. And then the cool thing with training kids is that you can quite easily look to be a pretty effective coach by almost doing nothing. So in effect, those kids are going to get better just through natural growth and development. So it's a win-win if you're looking to set up your own business. But strictly, it makes our ability to interpret changes in performance in response to training slightly challenging, given the fact that we need to factor in what's happening as a result of that natural development. We also need to factor in measurement error. And then providing we're confident in those two values, then we can actually start to see, right, is that the changes in performance strictly down to our training intervention? So these are some, variables I've pulled out of the literature in terms of some typical errors with some of the protocols that we would typically use in our own laboratory and also in the field. So I was sitting down at the front here and I realised that the top left figure was actually now taken 10 years ago, which made me feel pretty old. But in terms of using the jump mats that we referred to earlier, they were really useful. They helped me go to PhD, so it must have been all right. But to get out into the field and actually collect some metrics in terms of jump heights and stiffness qualities, model stiffness. So ultimately, when we're thinking of those metrics, it's really important that we're factoring in that degree of measurement error. And when we look at those coefficients of variation, we can expect those values to be higher in younger children. So it doesn't really matter what metric you look at, whether that is a vertical jump height, whether that is a stiffness measure, or whether some of the mechanical variables that are driving those changes and driving those performances, we're always likely to see greater variation in kids. Okay, their neuromuscular systems and their ability to replicate movements is far more varied. When we then move into focusing around, what is a smallest worthwhile change, what's a meaningful change in performance, we obviously need to factor in that typical error. And some of our data that we've looked at, Jon will probably touch on some stuff with some speed data, but certainly from the You may have seen the image of the girl in an isometric mid-thigh pull position. We managed to show some pretty good coefficient variations, some pretty tight typical error for that metric. But then certainly when we actually looked at the typical error in relation to the smallest worthwhile change, we need to be making sure that any changes in performance outweigh that typical error. And that's part of why we place a heavy emphasis on establishing reliability in those protocols. I've got 3 nice figures to show you in terms of natural development, so just bear with me. They kind of look non-linear, and that's really the big take-home. So whether we're looking at isometric strength is being reported in the literature in terms of, I think it was a static leg press, and they've actually looked at kilograms, changes in strength per year. And then what we can do is actually plot that against maturity status, and that maturity status is calculated in relation to peak height velocity. So actually when you look at the figures, we'll see -4 years, -3 years, -2 years, -1 year. We hit peak height velocity, and then we go to the other side. And what you'll see with that figure, believe me, is we see a non-linear development, and the peak occurs around about 6 to 12 months after peak height velocity for strength and for power. Now, granted, those measures tend to be fairly absolute, sort of robust measures in terms of maybe a rep max protocol or a vertical jump height. We need to actually establish a few more variables in terms of mechanical qualities. And why is that happening? Well, that 6 to 12 month window post peak height velocity really aligns with when we're going to see the maximum changes in muscle size. So actually we get this natural change in development. And we need to be aware of those natural increases, because as I said, if we're looking at training interventions, here's just an example. If we look at these changes here, we need to be aware of this, and it really highlights the absolute necessity for control group data in paediatric training studies, because we need to know if the adaptation that we see is a result of natural growth as opposed to our training intervention. Okay. Here we have just a couple of studies that we pulled out really to really delve into the developments of strength and power, and is this a possible thing for us to achieve in kids. Here we have a paper by Moran and colleagues that was published last year, and they looked at a series of studies, performed a meta-analyses, and it shows that actually the effect size in terms of the magnitude of training effect actually increases as we go from pre-peak height velocity through to circa peak height velocity, and then into post-peak height velocity. And that is reasonably consistent. We would probably expect the magnitude of change to increase, certainly when it ties in with what's happening as a result of natural growth and development. One thing just to bear in mind here is that the maturity stages were aligned with age group bands. So that's one of the failings at the moment in the paediatric literature, is that it's quite often the case that maturity status is not reported in the methods. So we tend to get age group analysis. And the paper by Harries and colleagues, that shows, again, from a systematic review and meta-analysis perspective, that even though there's a reasonable amount of heterogeneity in the data, we're seeing meaningful changes, significant improvements in a number of variables, most often cited as being vertical jump data. So we know then that the fact that, yes, we can see some changes as a result of growth, yes, we can see some changes as a result of training. This is just a study that I randomly chose in terms of just trying to evidence how this all sort of ties in together. So here we can see this is 16-year-old rugby league players, and they came into this study with a reasonable amount of training history, I suppose. That's no insight into their technical competence, granted, but they are coming in as, I guess, a trained population. And then we see, as a result of time, in terms of the exercise prescription that was put in place, we're seeing kind of like 30 kilogram increases in squat strength. So this is definitely something that we can achieve, and these sorts of changes are greater than that we're going to see from measurement error and from growth and maturation. So we can be a little more comfortable in terms of what we're seeing as a training response. And interestingly, I guess it wasn't a fluke, but this study was actually then used training intensities of up to 90% 1 rep max with these athletes. And really training intensity is a really interesting quality or prescription variable that we're looking to delve into in the next couple of years. And it really ties in with, when we look at the effective, the literature around effective training, this is probably my most cited paper at the moment in terms of me citing others' work. This is by Erzgeratsch's group, and really it looked at meta-analysis and systematic review of training-related studies in young athletes. It really wanted to delve into trying to identify, what is the ideal training prescription for developments in strength of younger athletes. And when you go into the summary here, we can see training programs, and as the length of training program increases, our control group data becomes more important because we're likely to see more growth rate changes. But yeah, we want to get greater return when we have longer training interventions, above 23 weeks. The other prescription variables are pretty similar, but this is the interesting one. The study shows quite clearly that we get greater returns in muscle strength when we actually expose athletes to higher intensities of training. And it's the one variable that really is lacking in terms of a good body of evidence now, in terms of empirical research that delves into the effects of different training intensities from a strength training perspective. And that's always really been, I think, associated with the fact that people have had previously held misconceptions around safety resistance training. But I won't bore you, but I've got a stack of literature that we could go through that shows that is very much misfounded. So important caveat with this study at the back end is that they really do hammer home in terms of the importance of technical competency. So don't leave here thinking that you need to go on 1 rep max all your kids, but making sure that we are building that on good quality technique. And my final slide, and I'm conscious that my former PhD supervisors follow me, so I better not be late. We have here, this is another systematic review meta-analysis that was released by David Bain's group. And if you want a sort of a go-to, up-to-date reference, then I suggest you have a look at this one. It delves into looking at the effects of different training in terms of whether we give a strength training stimulus or a power training stimulus, and the effects that has on various functional skills. And it does lead, or it does lean towards, I guess, the notion of specific adaptation to imposed demands, in that we get a greater return on jump measures when we provide a power training stimulus, okay? And then we get a greater return in terms of strength and some small, in all fairness, changes for speed work when we give that strength training stimulus. But across those categories, the return is always greater when we actually give strength training stimulus as opposed to power. So where this is going is that whether we are looking to develop strength, power or speed, we really should be trying to provide that power training stimulus that is based on a foundation of strength and movement quality. Okay? So that must have been worth waiting for, right? Because of the technical delays. But here's a hand over to Jon, who's going to take you home for some literature around speed development.
Yeah, so just going to start with why is speed important, and hopefully that's a bit of a no-brainer. Speed, distinguishing characteristic in many sports. Sports organisations want to identify children who are fast, and they want to improve the speed they actually they want to develop those qualities over time. So if we look at how we actually test speed, there's a number of things we can use. We've got the timing gauge, radar, apps. We've used all of these. They can all be used to give force velocity profile at the moment. We're using that to inform training. I guess a practical comment with the SMARTSPEED, we've got lots of this kit. So at our peak, we've gone up to having 12 timing gates, so 12 individuals sprinting and being measured at any one time. So within a testing session of a few hours or a day, we've got through hundreds, probably up to 1,000 sprints in terms of collecting data. And then it's all collected centrally on a PDA to export. The other two methods tend to just use with individual athletes, so you're getting less data. We look at the reliability of those in terms of speed measures, sprint times or max velocity. They're all of good, similar reliability, low coefficients of variation of sort of 1% up to about 3%. So these are all studies in youth athletes from our group. SMARTSPEED comes out as slightly more reliable. It's the system we use the most. With all of these systems, we've looked at the reliability of the force velocity profile, so getting maximum theoretical force, maximum theoretical velocity, and maximum power during sprinting. So we've got pretty tight reliability, close to the sort of 10% threshold that we'd really like. Again, if you look down the left-hand side, the better variables, they come from the timing gate system. So the SMARTSPEED system, probably because it's just slightly more reliable at picking out those sprint times compared to the other systems. And Rhodri mentioned about growth and maturation, so I'm not going to labour on that point, but we really need to take this into account and what sort of changes are worthwhile. How much faster does a child need to get to make it a reasonable training gain? And what we'll see with our measurement error is that we can detect those gains very easily. For natural development, sprint speed looks something like this. We've got a pre-adolescent spurt where children get faster, or boys. And then there's a sort of a lull, a plateauing period, hit the growth spurt, get a lot faster again. Okay, so we can kind of take that into account. If we narrow down a bit more around the adolescent period, so here we've got years from peak height velocity, so this is kind of really in the growth spurt here. We see that similar pattern. A couple of years before the growth spurt, speed doesn't improve much, and then it really takes off with the growth spurt. So rapid increase, longer legs, longer muscle fibres, more speed generation, and that's really down to an increase in stride length. So is your training effect kind of adding over and above that, or are you really just thinking you've got a kind of training effect in its growth and maturation? So again, that is non-linear, so what I'm going to do now is show a slide that's a linear relationship, just to confuse things, but if we look over the long term, speed development will approximate to a linear relationship. It will smooth out. It wouldn't ever look like this for an individual athlete. But for the general population, this is based on hundreds of kids we've run through SMARTSPEED, and these are 2 other studies which I believe use SMARTSPEED timing gates as well. We can see the rate and change 10-metre sprint time. Now over this side, you can see they start off at very different levels. Faster kids recruited into football, but actually the rate of change is similar between all the groups. So in these instances, probably being in a football academy hasn't added much over and above the natural development. What we also see with the academy data is that speed development really plateaus after 16. So it's kind of when that natural growth and maturation phase is coming to an end for this kind of fairly early maturing group. So if you want to judge your own programs, look at your historical data over a long time. What's your average rates of improvement over those year groups? Are you above and beyond what you expect for the general population or not? You see this for 10-metre time there, we've got an increase of kind of 2.8 up to 2 or so %. For 20 metres, it's exactly the same picture. The improvements get a little bit larger, those percentage increases, and that's percentage improvement per year on the left side. So the longer the distance, the greater the relative improvements. How do you really develop speed then? Okay, it develops naturally if you want to add additional training gains. You've got lots of choices. Here's a selection of studies. Okay, we've got them slightly colour-coded. So up the top here are those before the growth spurt, during the growth spurt, after the growth spurt, just approximated from chronological age. The total training sessions basically shows all of these studies were between 6 weeks and 16 weeks, relatively short. And we can see good gains up here above our level of measurement error in a short period of time. Similar when going through the growth spurt, and a bit more mixed down here. Okay, general thought is central nervous system developing really quickly before the growth spurt, so it might be a good time to really get neural adaptation. It might be a bit easier to get some of those changes. If we look down this middle column, we can see there's lots of different training modes that get us a positive response. Strength training, plyometric training, training that combines the two. Two of the take-home messages from this: there aren't many studies that have just looked at speed training. We get a couple on there that are sprint training. They tend to be non-speed specific, and we don't have many long-term studies. As I mentioned, most of these will be around 8 weeks in duration. What did we see when we put in a periodised long-term training study over a school year? Well, in the first half of the year, when we focused on strength and resistance training to improve movement competency, general preparation to increase strength, strength increased a lot, speed didn't. When we went into the second part of the programme, where we really upped the intensity of the resistance training because we've made the children competent, we've given them the general strength rates, then we started to see the transference of those gains to fairly large improvements in speed. Again, much greater than our measurement error, and much greater than we would expect to see by natural growth and maturation. So we can definitely affect speed. In terms of force velocity profiling, okay, SmartSpeed will now do this automatically for you. Keep running this through the timing gate, get your force velocity plots. So we see that force velocity, and we get a nice parabolic power curve, and that's been used for training prescription. So this was suggested by Matt Cross. So if we look in the middle there, we can see the speed at which a child produces their power, and it's 50% of their maximal speed. So what we then do is we load them with sleds of different weights, and we run them through the speed gates, and we look at how much they slow with different amounts of loading. And if we find the load that keeps them at that speed, in theory, with training that should maximise their power response. What we might also look at are using different zones. So we go here with a heavy load to really slow them, using resistance sprints, a sprint-specific form of resistance training. So rather than doing vertical squats, let's do some horizontal real heavy pulling. Or we might go lighter, with more of a speed strength stimulus. And that's what we've had a student do. He's done quite a bit of work on this, Mike Cahill. We just flag up results from one of his studies that's currently under preparation. So we've got 4 groups: unresisted training, light resistance, optimised around power, and heavy. Notice here, even with light, we've got 45% of body mass, 90%, 133%. So this is much heavier than in previous resistance sprint work because we're looking at this as a resistance training stimulus. And what we see, we just follow those sprint times along, look at the little annotations. We get significant improvements in sprint time with resistance. We don't get that just with speed. Why do we get that? Well, we look at these mechanical variables, and as we start to add resistance, we get more and more changes, particularly in force, driving an improvement in power. What did that give us overall? Well, these are the percentage improvements in speed. So we don't see much with unresisted until we start to go to the longer sprints. So that might get more if we kind of add further measures. And as we go across, we can see the improvements increase over an acceleration phase. 7% improvements with a real heavy sled. You know, that's real bang for your buck over an 8-week programme. But those gains kind of start to reduce over the longer distances. So good gains for acceleration. We've got better gains just going heavy than what's being proposed as an optimised load. And we think that's because these children have come from a low training age in terms of horizontal resistance training, which would be the same for most athletes. You know, most training in terms of resistance is vertical in nature. This reinforces Rhodri's message about training intensity. We want to get that resistance training stimulus, and here we're just doing it in a sprint-specific method. So it brings us to our conclusions. Okay, so we can increase all our qualities just with growth and maturation. Okay, that happens in youth. We need to take that into account. To do that, we also need to look at how reliable our measures are, and thankfully we can see that we've got a lot of reliable metrics. We also then need to have a look at our training literature, and we can see we can get positive responses with all different types of training. And we want varied programmes for our youth athletes. So they need to improve lots of qualities, but the type of quality you want to improve is going to respond most to the specific type of training. If you want to improve speed, do some sprint-specific resistance training. If you want to improve power, do some plyometric power-based training. That would be the same for strength, but also strength underpins everything. We need that strength base to be able to go and do power training. If we look at heavy resisted sleds, we say that's given us the strength base to go and sprint and accelerate at speed. Well, that's probably taken us up to or slightly over time.
Just in time. Thank you.
So, everything worked out perfectly, just as we all planned. I think now we're going to go down to the SmartSpeed booth. I think this room is getting used again, so if anyone, if you want to chat to any of the speakers, we'll all be down there.
Thank you.
Thank you.